Anong alam mo sa electoral reforms?
Wala ano nga ba yun?
Pagbabago lang yan ng term limits ng mga politiko.
Di ba pandaraya lang yun? Automated pandaraya?
Automated elections na nga, di ba? Ano pa ba kailangan?
Paano maiiwasan ang masamang epekto ng fake news at disinformation sa mga kampanya ng mga politiko?
Dapat kasi may fact-checking muna bago i-share o i-post kung saan.
I-report yung mga naglalabas ng fake news sa FB.
Dapat sa legit sources kumukuha ng impormasyon eh. Hindi basta sa TikTok o FB o kung sinong vlogger na feeling journalist.
I-deactivate na kasi yung mga troll accounts at pages na nagpapakalat ng mga fake news.
Sapat na ba ang representasyon ng kababaihan sa politika?
Hindi, tsaka kahit yung ibang babae nakaupo, hindi naman para sa babaeng pinaglalaban.
Kulang pa, pero may progress naman kahit papano.
Kalahati kami ng populasyon, pero kulang naman nagre-representa sa amin kasi konti lang naman ang nahahalal.
Mas marami pa ring lalaki kaysa babaeng nakaupo sa pwesto. Sana mas napapakinggan naman kaming mga babae.
Balota at Pulitika sa 2022. May bago ba? Mula sa hashtag Pilipilunas 2022 webinar series. Hatid sa inyo ng UP Diliman Office of the Chancellor Task Force Nation Building at ng Center for Integrative and Development Studies.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our forum, Balota at Pulitika sa 2022, May Bago Ba. Today's forum is part of the series Pilipilunas 2022, Pagbangon at Pagsulong tungo sa Magandang Buhay at Bukas. Pilipilunas is a project of the University of the Philippines Diliman's Task Force on a Blueprint for Building the Nation. I'm Rimban, Executive Director of the Asian Center for Journalism at the Ateneo. I will be your moderator for this forum. To formally open this event, I'd like to call on the chair of the Task Force Blueprint for Building a Nation. She is Associate Professor at the UP Asian Center and convener of the Political Economy Program under the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies. Please welcome Dr. Antoinette Raquisa.
Thank you, Luz, Professor Rimban. Good afternoon to everyone. It's my pleasure to open today's webinar on a topic that is understandably hugging the headlines and will continue to do so up to next year, the 2022 national elections. Today's event is, as Professor Rimban mentioned, is the third in the hashtag Pilipilunas 2022 webinar series that the Task Force Nation Building under the UP Diliman Office of the Chancellor has organized in partnership with the academic community in order to help shape the national conversation on high impact issues and policy reforms leading up to the next election. The Task Force Nation Building would like to thank the Program on Social and Political Change of the UP Center for Integrative and Development Studies for convening this afternoon's webinar entitled Balota at Pulitika sa 2022 May Bago Ba. As conceived, the webinar seeks to address the nature of Philippine political and electoral system and starts with the analysis that historically Philippine-style democracy is personalistic democracy. Elections operate based on personal popularity, fear, and patronage as mediators of public demands and interests. The country's political parties have time and again proved themselves to be ineffective, weak, and unstable. Parties are but malleable organizations shaped and reshaped according to the whims of individual politicians and celebrities during elections. In fact, today we have senatorial candidates running for 2 or more presidential slates, a trend suggesting the further weakening of political parties. This webinar examines the question on the future of Philippine political parties. Ideally, political parties act as a bridge between the people and government. How does this ideal line up with the Philippines' personalistic political system? How do we build a strong party system in the face of patronage electoral politics? The 2022 elections also present distinct questions and challenges. We ask, what is the shape of electoral campaigns in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic? The pandemic has also exposed the vulnerabilities of a minimalist state in the face of a national emergency and the shallow foundations of the country's growth economies. Will the elections open up spaces for new political actors, institutional reforms, and bold policy initiatives? Can the advent of a new social media provide the platform for popular calls for effective government, as well as accountability and transparency in governance? What does a women's vote mean in today's polarized political environment? These are some of the questions that the Balota at Pulitika sa 2022 Ano ang Bago webinar will examine. Before ending, allow me to briefly discuss the objectives of the Task Force Nation Building, partner research programs, and individual scholars who are mobilizing to bring to you the Pilipilunas webinar series. In February of this year, UP Diliman Chancellor Fidel Nemenso created the task force for a blueprint on building the nation, or simply Task Force Nation Building, to organize forums to present the UP community's problem-solving research outputs to policymakers, direct stakeholders, and the public. Addressing the multi-dimensional crisis our nation is in, #Pilipilunas 2022 has adopted the theme, Pagbangon at Pagsulong tungo sa magandang bukas at buhay ng Pilipino. The task force has identified 6 webinars this year. Pilipilunas 2022 opened with our Kamusta Bayan webinar last August and went on to the next webinar on the public transportation sector last October 25 to highlight UP as both a policy actor and an incubator. Today's event on electoral and political reforms will be followed by a webinar on November 26th on the local government code 30 years after. In December, we will roll out 2 Pilipilunas webinars, one on Philippine and regional security on December 3, and another on economic recovery and transformation on December 13. As we speak, the task force is already preparing next year's webinars. To end, through the Pilipilunas 2022 webinars, the UP Diliman Office of the Chancellor, Task Force Nation Building, and partner research programs and institutions aim to bring the university's expertise to bear on the pressing issues of our time. Our goal is to draw up viable policy recommendations in dialogue with government, direct stakeholders, and civil society, and to consolidate these into a governance agenda that we hope to present to national candidates and the public leading up to and beyond the 2022 national elections. On behalf of the task force, I would like to invite everyone to take this journey with us. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Dr. Antoinette Raquisa, Chair of UP Diliman's Task Force Nation Building. Let's now proceed to the main event. We have 3 speakers. I'd like to introduce the first one. Our first speaker is Dr. Jorge Tigno. He's a professor of political science at UP Diliman. He has studied labor migration and migration policies, civil society and local governance, as well as electoral and party system reforms in the Philippines. He is a fellow at the Social Weather Stations and a member of the Philippine Migration Research Network, the Philippine Political Science Association, and the National Research Council of the Philippines. He is currently Editor-in-Chief of the Philippine Social Sciences Review. Dr. Jorge Tigno presentation is titled Old Wine in New Bottles, Party System and Electoral Reform Initiatives in the Philippines. Dr. Tigno, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Luz. On behalf of Jean and Aries, I'd like to express my gratitude also to the task force for allowing us to make this presentation on this topic, especially to Tessa Tadem and to Tonet Rakisa for giving us some space to discuss this issue. And I'd also like to thank in advance our moderator, Luz, from Ateneo, and as well as our distinguished panel of election experts / reactors, starting with the department's Suki, Paul Hutchcroft from ANU, former Comelec Commissioner Attorney Luie Guia, another Suki of ours in UP, and of course James Jimenez, our beloved Comelec spokesperson. Well, in relation to the elections, the Department of Political Science continues to administer its UP sa Halalan platform as a venue for online discussions pertinent to elections in the Philippines. We also provide resources that are publicly accessible as a repository of content related to elections and Philippine politics. And I just want to advertise that here. It's free and open to the media, to civil society organizations, even political parties and anyone interested in the elections and Philippine politics. Sa simula nitong aking presentation, I would just like to say at the outset that hindi ko pag-uusapan dito yung ano ang mga specific reforms, no, na kailangan. But rather on why we need them, borrowing heavily from the ideas of Paul Hutchcroft, and also how these reforms have fared in the post-authoritarian period specifically. And in particular, my presentation is going to be about the initiatives to reform our party and electoral systems, specific to those that have come from Congress. So, sa bilang panimula, no, magbibigay muna ako ng konting overview about what our electoral and party systems are all about. I'm pretty sure all of you know of these things already. I just want to make sure that we are pretty much on the same page. No? In very broad terms, the electoral system determines how votes are converted into seats. The party system refers to the nature and character of political organizations that compete for positions in government. And the electoral and party systems are made up of basically rules, processes, and structures that determine how elections are conducted and how results are determined, as well as who or which organizations get to compete for such positions. These systems are made up of three sets of infrastructures. In the case of the Philippines, you have a regulatory infrastructure that provides the legal and constitutional framework for our system. You have an agency infrastructure that provides the organizational capacity to carry out its framework, and the process infrastructure, which is actually what is being carried out. In the case of the Philippines, we follow a simple plurality system, a winner-take-all system, where you have, at least in the specific cases of the election of the members of our executive department, both at the local and national. We also have a multi-member plurality system for members of the Senate and the local councils. And finally, we have a mixed system for the House of Representatives. You have a single member district system and a party list system. But essentially, what we have is, in practice, historically, a system of rule by the minority. Lastly, our party and electoral systems are by design, or maybe by default, not majoritarian and not proportional, but they do allow for direct voting by the people of the respective candidates of choice, and provides for a winner-take-all arrangement. And because of this, we also have political organizations that are highly motivated by personal claims, no? Putting into shame the expression trabaho lang, no? Walang personalan. In the Philippines, party politics is personal politics. Moving on, I'd like to sort of contextualize this further by discussing very briefly how important elections and parties are in the case of the Philippines. Filipinos do place much hope in having honest and credible elections, as well as strong parties that they can distinguish from each other. Public confidence in parties and elections is increasing based on data from the World Values Survey. In 2019, more than 2 out of every 3 Filipinos have expressed confidence in our elections. Almost the same percentage say free elections are essential to our democratic system in 2012. In 1996 and 2001, around 44% of Filipino adults at the time expressed confidence in parties. By 2012, this rose to almost 50%, 48.7%. And by 2019, a majority of the public, 53.6%, had expressed confidence in our political parties. In 2019, 3 in 4 Filipinos said their votes are counted fairly, while Director James would be happy to know this, that 70% of Filipinos say election officials are fair in the conduct of their jobs. Most importantly, nearly all Filipinos, 95.5%, say that having honest elections would make a lot of difference in their lives. But while Filipinos are hopeful, they are also anxious about the challenges and problems besetting our electoral system. Around 3/4 say that voters are bribed during elections and that rich people buy the elections, the results of the elections. It's safe to say at this point that there's an underlying clamor to reform our electoral and party systems. Why do we need these reforms? There can be several reasons for why we need them. And here I borrow again heavily from the ideas of Paul Hutchcroft on electoral system redesign. A free choice is the bedrock of any credible electoral process, of any democratic process. However, free choice can be seriously undermined by violence, by patronage, and money politics. Hence, there's a need to disincentivize patronage, to limit it, to keep it at bay so that it doesn't erode free choice. A strong and stable party system is one where party organizations are distinguishable from each other beyond their personal leaderships. Parties based on programs of government offer real and sensible choices to voters. When the existing rules of the game are such that parties fail to offer real and distinct options to their constituents, parties are shortchanging the voters. Apart from their color or the faces of their leaders, there's nothing much that they project to their voters. And this is actually, I think, shortchanging the voters. As I will argue also later on, the Constitution doesn't really mandate a specific electoral system for the country. The specific features of our party system have always been historically and primarily a function of the election code, a default reading of the Constitution, and congressional legislative action. And such actions range from laws enacted to synchronize the elections, to automate the elections, to allow for absentee voting, as well as party list representation. Interestingly, as I said earlier, the Constitution does not even specify the number or proportion of votes necessary for a candidate to be declared the winner. It's the election code that provides for this, which says that the person with the highest number of votes is declared elected. But still, we assume that the plurality system is a given and the default approach to any electoral contest. And so that's why I'm saying that our electoral system has been prescribed more by habit and by default than by maybe anything else. Indeed, the silence of the Constitution is evident in other areas, such as the separate voting for president and vice president. I mean, this is a kind of interpretation of the quote, direct vote of the people provision in the Constitution for president and vice president. Voting for individual candidates instead of political parties outside of the PL system. Again, that's not provided in the Constitution. Synchronizing our elections. And even the 3-seat cap in the party list system is not actually specified constitutionally. These are aspects of our electoral system that are more a product, again, of habitual reading of our history and our Constitution. There's certainly much room to maneuver here and to reform without having to go through the tedious and costly and risky process of amending the Constitution. I see this as an opportunity to utilize other avenues to institutionalize reforms and redesign our system more effectively and more sustainably. This brings us now to the question of what has Congress done to introduce and institutionalize these reforms. Since 2002, at least, there have been dozens of bills filed and refiled in Congress to reform our party and electoral systems. These have taken many forms, from instituting sanctions against turncoats, providing subsidies to parties, introducing amendments to the Omnibus Election Code, among others. And with these bills that have been filed, hearings have been conducted also in both chambers of Congress. And these hearings have been participated in by various electoral reform groups. I'm sure Atty. Luie Guia is very familiar with these electoral reform groups. Most importantly, these initiatives were made with the strong support of the congressional leaderships at the time. So between 2004 and 2019, over a 15-year period, no less than 56 bills were filed in both the Senate and the House, specific to strengthening the party system and providing funds therefore. However, not one has been passed into law. And so why have these reform initiatives in Congress failed or faltered? I think it's important to say here that creating a strong and stable consensus-based and reform-oriented congressional leadership is necessary, but I don't think it's sufficient. It's enough to push for such legislative reforms. Popular support and pressure is vital to any reform initiative, and it's here where reform movements can play a significant role in terms of promoting and projecting a popular political education agenda that can induce a groundswell of support for such reforms. So in the absence of such groundswell support, I mean, your legislators are bound to lose interest at some point. A challenge to any reform initiative. So a challenge to any reform initiative is to develop the capacity of legislators themselves to appreciate the value of a reform agenda. That they shouldn't think of it simply in terms of an administrative action that they would like to take to win POGI points or something like that. But these are serious initiatives that they have to take seriously. In a lot of cases, politicians have this attitude that if the system allowed them to win, in the first place, then there's no need to fix it. Okay. Another challenge is to be able to fight the attitude of complacency among incumbents who typically see the future only in the short term. So I'm going to change it, but only in that direction that benefits me. Okay. So legislators can also be distracted by other things that they would deem urgent as well, like aside from their re-election, their oversight function, and other things. Legislators' diminished interest may also be due to the uncertainty that might ensue if such reform initiatives were to suddenly come into effect. So a lot of them are also at the back of their minds, probably apprehensive about pushing for these reform initiatives because it puts everything in jeopardy, their status as incumbents in jeopardy. legislators' diminished interest may also be due to their diminished capacity to look into those innovations. Thus, their usual response is to go into default mode, submitting the same bills over and over again. Yeah? Ultimately, any legislated reform initiative would need to take this matter into account, providing a degree of certainty, credibility, predictability in the outcome of the alternative electoral and party process. And I think this is, second to the last slide. What direction should these reforms be taking? We can start by moving away from the rule of the minority to rule by the majority. We can do this by introducing a more majoritarian system, like a runoff system or a second ballot system in the election for the presidency at least. Introducing this reform doesn't require changing any provision in the Constitution. It only needs to change, we only need to change our mentalities, our habits, and ways of interpreting the Constitution. Of course, we also need to amend the Omnibus Election Code because that's where you find that kind of provision on the elections. But that would be less tedious than tinkering with the Constitution altogether. Proportional representation can be encouraged with the removal of the 3-seat cap in the party list system. Indeed, a different kind of cap can be introduced if you are not if you're not open to really releasing removing the ceiling. Then a different kind of ceiling can be introduced, like no one party can occupy a maximum of 30% of the seats in the House, or 50% of the seats of the House reserved for party list representatives. We can also give voters the option to choose parties rather than individual candidates, perhaps through a system of block voting. Desynchronizing the elections between local and national positions can greatly unburden the voters and also our administrators of the challenges that they are faced when they do synchronized elections every 3 years. We can allow voters to choose the president and vice president as a tandem or as a joint ticket. Again, this is not something that would require a constitutional amendment. These are just some of the changes that can be done. And what's good, as I said, is that they don't require the need to amend the Constitution. They still require some effort, like coming up with a new omnibus election code or revising the code altogether. But it would not be the same as having an entirely different Constitution. What can our university do? What can UP do? As the national university, UP can provide a laboratory for such innovations. In fact, for instance, I keep telling this to my students, why can't student councils adopt a majoritarian and proportional system in the election for student councils? That can actually show the rest of the country that, look, this system will work. You just have to give it a chance. The final point that I would like to make here is that what I'm selling here is not by any means a magic potion that's going to miraculously solve, our problems overnight. There's no such thing as a silver bullet, or there's no such thing as a best electoral system. The best electoral system, I think, is an evolving electoral system. For effective and appropriate reforms to take place, it must involve all the stakeholders, including, most importantly, the people themselves. And at the end of the day, for a reform agenda to succeed, it needs to be sustained and must evolve and involve the people with the end in view of minimizing costs and increasing their effective benefits. So, dyan po nagtatapos ang aking presentation. Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat, Dr. Jorge Tigno. So political parties abound in the Philippines, but in name only. They hardly represent or rarely represent real programs, policies, philosophies, and serve to promote only the names and dynasties that carry the party name. They hinder free choice. Attempts have been made to incumbents aren't inclined to change the system that got them elected. Okay, we now proceed to our next speaker, Dr. Jean Encinas-Franco. She's a fixture on TV talk shows discussing current political issues. Her research interests are on gender and politics and the politics of labor migration from the Philippines. Dr. Encinas-Franco will be talking about women's representation in electoral politics and the 2022 elections. Dr. Jean Encinas-Franco.
Thank you very much, Luz, and good afternoon to everyone. Allow me to thank UPCIDS Director Teresa Tadem, Dr. Rakiza, Dr. Tigno, SEEDS program conveners, and of course the organizers and staff of today's forum for inviting me today. I'm very grateful that you consider women's role in politics as an important issue that we need to talk about as we talk about the coming 2022 elections. So thank you. Let me begin my presentation, which briefly aims to discuss the relevance to democracy of women's representation in electoral politics, point out significant barriers to women's entry in electoral politics. Next slide, please. And recommend key policy directions to increase women's representation in politics. By representation, I refer to descriptive representation, which means numbers rather than women's substantive representation, referring to women politicians espousing policies and programs for women. Next. Indeed, the Philippines has made significant strides in legislating for women's rights. We're very proud of that, in fact. A key factor paving the way for this is the provision in the 1987 Constitution, stating that the state recognizes the role of women in nation building and shall ensure the fundamental equality before the law of women and men. This provision is in fact a product of the women's movement's role in the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos and its subsequent active participation in framing the post-EDSA Constitution. Next. However, 35 years after EDSA and 84 years after the grant of suffrage to women, to Filipino women, women are still very much a minority in the formal political sphere. Next. In 2001, only a small percentage of women comprised the legislative branch. Next. However, there has been a significant increase in both legislative chambers over the past 2 decades. Next. After the most recent 2019 elections, women now comprise 28% of the House of Representatives and 29% of the Senate. Next, please. However, women still comprise a mere 23% of the total elective positions in the country, including women politicians at the local levels, according to the Philippine Statistics Authority. Moreover, even though there has been an increase in the level of women politicians gaining seats in all levels of government, a significant percentage of them come from political families. Next. Notably, women have not reached the 30% international benchmark putatively needed to form a critical mass to make a significant difference. Available data from the Commission on Elections show that in 2019, in fact, only 20% of candidates for all electoral positions were women. So what is the relevance of women's participation? Why do we need to elect women in formal politics? Women's participation in electoral politics is integral to strengthening democracy since they comprise half of the population and should in fact be represented in political processes. If sustainable progress is to be made, the argument is that it must include women's meaningful participation in political life. Second is that women's meaningful participation in politics results in better social welfare outcomes in terms of an increased budget for social services, among others. This is called substantive representation. And thirdly, women in the political sphere create visibility for women leaders. and serving as role models for future generations. This is often referred to as symbolic representation. Next, but why is it that women are actually not in formal politics? Why are they not joining elections? No? The Philippine electoral system's first past the post-electoral type, coupled with the lack of well-developed political parties, inhibits women's entry into politics. Without party discipline and institutionalized rules within parties, one cannot even begin to think of an internal party procedure in which a certain percentage of women must be included in the party slate. It is also observed that countries with proportional representation systems can have more women in elective positions. The second barrier, please go back to the previous slide. Masculinist campaign strategies such as electoral violence, money politics, and vote buying can potentially discourage women from running for public office. In the Philippines, traditional norms about women's proper place in the public sphere remain an obstacle. No? The 7th round of the World Values Survey has found that more than half of Filipinos believe that men make better political leaders than women. In the same survey, nearly 70% agreed that men have more right to a job than women, while more than 80% agreed that being a housewife is just as fulfilling as having a job. Nonetheless, because the country has a vibrant civil society, high literacy rates for women, and has had 2 women heads of state, it scores highly on global ranking indices of gender progress. The invisibility of women's concerns in electoral politics is also an issue. No? In electoral polls is also an issue. Survey polls hardly disaggregate voter preferences by sex and age group. No? This is also the case for survey questions on what issues matter to the voters. The result is that there is little incentive for coalition or party leaders to field women candidates or cater to women voters other than based on popularity, tokenism, or pedigree. Next is that the presence of violence against women in politics and the ways this has been prominent in this administration discourages women from entering politics. First, it perpetuates the notion that women are unqualified to lead. In the run-up to the 2022 elections, this trend continues. One is reminded of what US Speaker Nancy Pelosi said in 1985. The word campaign is a war term, she said. So when you go into a campaign, you just prepare to go to war. If you think this is an exercise in civic activity, then you are going to be surprised. Close quote. Media coverage also sometimes play into gender stereotypes of women candidates. Questions on balancing work and family life are normally asked of women candidates and not of men, no? As if fathers have not been invented. Next is that women candidates themselves likewise play into gender stereotypes because they are aware that this caters to how voters might perceive them, such as framing themselves as mothers or as ates or as titas. No? Lastly, political institutions themselves must provide a conducive environment for women politicians to thrive. Emphasis on seniority for committee chairpersonships, gender stereotypes benefit men than women. So next, what are some recommendations? A scholar of feminist politics remarked, when she studied about the near monopoly of men in politics. Anne Phillips, her name is Anne Phillips, said that there is no argument for justice that can defend the current state of affairs. So here are some recommendations that can be explored to address this in the context of the Philippines. Political party reforms must, of course, be instituted, just like what Dr. Tigno said a while ago, but with a mandate that parties allot at least 30% of their slate to women. They should be banned from participating in the elections if they fail to do so. Training on women's rights, gender budgeting, gender and development must be an integral component of political party development. There is already a pending legislation with this. in both houses of with this aim in both houses of Congress currently. Disadvantaged women from marginalized sectors must also be given priority in training and candidate selection, because this will also give them a chance to participate other than just merely from political families. This will potentially increase descriptive representation and heighten awareness and appreciation for gender issues among party members. Those from political families can also benefit from this. In the long term, this can avoid the tendency to ghettoize women's issues as a mere sectoral concern rather than a matter that should be mainstreamed in development planning. Next is that many consider the Philippine party list law distorted by traditional politicians and even political families as a route to enter politics. For this reason, there are calls to abolish the law. However, my recent interviews with legislators for a book chapter, legislators from progressive party lists demonstrate a better understanding of women's issues than MPs or legislators elected from single-member districts. Therefore, the law can be amended to better reflect proportional representation and learn from the models of other countries. Reforms can also improve women's descriptive representation by adopting alternating or zipper-style lists, as Soc Reyes would call it, no, of male and female party nominees. Survey companies must also be encouraged to present sex disaggregated data on their results to better appreciate how issues and candidates differently impact men and women. Media groups, television networks, and advocates may also adopt the UN Women and the Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance monitoring tool on gender-sensitive elections and political debates coverage. There are many other tools available with this purpose in mind. The Comelec may wish to partner with the media on this initiative. Legislation on violence against women in politics, yes, this is what it is called, no? Including those committed during elections, must be explored. Bolivia legislated this in 2012. Other options would be a code of conduct for candidates during the elections, awareness raising, and amendments to the Omnibus Election Code towards preventing violence against women in politics. Support for women's caucuses in Congress must also be enhanced, no? Along with the establishment of gender-responsive parliamentary rules and procedures. The recent publication of guidelines on how to be a gender-sensitive legislator in the House of Representatives, I think, is very much a step in the right direction. This ends my presentation. I'd be happy to respond to your questions and comments later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jean Franco. The Philippines ranks high in terms of women in elective position, but the numbers are not enough to tip the balance, and the existing system is stacked against women, as you mentioned, including the traditional masculinist strong arm style of campaigning that's driving women away from the electoral arena. Thank you for that. Now we move on to our third speaker. He is Dr. Aries Arugay, a visiting fellow at the Regional Strategic and Political Studies Program of the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He's also editor-in-chief of Asian Politics and Policy, published by Wiley Blackwell, and the US-based Policy Studies Organization. His research interests are comparative democracy, security sector reform, civil-military relations, and foreign policy. In 2020, Dr. Arugay was named the National Academy of Science and Technology Outstanding Young Scientist in Political Science. He will be talking about social media and the 2022 Philippine election campaign landscape. Dr. Aries Arugay.
Thank you very much, Professor Luz Rimban. Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Many thanks to the organizers of this webinar, particularly the UP Task Force on Nation Building, as well as the UPC Ideas Program on Social and Political Change for the invitation. I would also mention that I am currently on sabbatical as a full-time faculty of the UP Department of Political Science, but is still based in Quezon City, given my fellowship in ICEA Singapore is mainly non-resident. What I will share today is part of my previous research on social media in the 2016 presidential elections, but as well as preliminary ideas on my current research as an ICEA's non-resident fellow. My presentation will be comprised of 3 parts. First is I summarize existing research about social media and electoral politics, and also share some of the insights of the study that we have conducted together with Aim Sin Peng and Dimitar Gurjov, 2 other political scientists, on the role of social media in the 2016 presidential elections. The second part maps the social media universe in the Philippines and its relevance in the upcoming 2022 elections. And finally, the last part will delve into the reforms, policy actions, and possibly recommended multi-sectoral initiatives to combat disinformation and fake news in electoral politics. So a key research question in political science, particularly in electoral politics, as well as in democracy studies, is the role of social media in the elections, and what makes for a successful social media campaign that will necessarily translate to a victory in the ballot. So far, the literature and the scholarship has tended to divide the models of social media campaigning into 3. The first is what we call the broadcast model. It is described as being the savvy, active, and sometimes populist model of social media campaigning. It is seen more as top-down, as social media is the social media campaign of a politician is handled by professional social media managers of information and campaign. In a way, this is an active and savvy type of social media campaigning. In the 2016 US elections, for example, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump social media campaign could be described as belonging to the broadcast model. In our own elections in 2016, in the way that we typologized it, examples would be the social media campaign embarked by Senator Grace Poe and the late Senator Miriam Defensor Santiago. If we use a broadcast model of social media campaigning, it is seen more as the more engaged social media users are to a particular politician's campaign, the more that it will translate to votes. We have seen this also, for example, in Hillary Clinton's campaign, as well as in Donald Trump's campaign, although both politicians have different subtypes within the larger broadcast model. Hillary Clinton represents the more savvy type, the more professional type, while Donald Trump was hands-on, was more populist, and was more direct in his social media campaign. The grassroots model referred to a more decentralized, bottom-up insurgent approach, wherein politicians and candidates take a back seat and where information and campaigning are handled primarily by their supporters, or what we call fans. Certain studies on citizen-initiated campaigning argues that devolving power over core campaigning tasks to the grassroots, political parties and candidates could mobilize more voters than the more fabricated, professionalized social media campaigning strategy. So the more this grassroots model somehow approximate a more authentic type of campaigning, wherein it's voluntary participation of the people to promote as well as endorse their particular candidate without getting cues or even support from the candidate themselves. In her study on Russian influence operations in the US 2016 elections, Dr. Jameson said that the success of the Russian disinformation campaign in the US was because of the readily available pro-Trump supporters who were enthusiastically amplifying the message, and these supporters might not be necessarily commanded or directed top-down by the Donald Trump campaign. In between these two extremes of a top-down model as well as a bottom-up model is a fused, connected, and crowdsourced two-way model called in the literature the self-actualizing model, wherein both top-down messaging and bottom-up mobilization is used. In this regard, politicians don't simply hand down campaign messages for their supporters to diffuse or seek ideas from, or let just grassroots campaigning be the model. In this particular model, there is more conversation on the part of the candidates as well as their supporters on how best to carry out their campaign. So this is highly interactive as well as dynamic that includes political involvement. So in this case, it's really more the politician seeking. So perhaps, give me a sec. So may I ask if my video is, okay, great. Because I got a message that my video is not being shared. In the self-actualizing model, the politician or the candidate, as well as the grassroots members of their campaign, are more in a dynamic conversation on how best to lead a particular campaign. Now, I'd like to share a study that we have conducted as early as 2017 and was published in the Journal of East Asian Studies, entitled Strong Fans, Weak Campaigns, Social Media and Duterte in the 2016 Philippine Election. This is a multi-method study wherein we carried out an original online survey of Filipino Facebook users of 621 respondents, are randomly selected from Metro Manila, Mindanao, Luzon, and Visayas. Apart from that, we also looked at all the official Facebook activities of the 5 major presidential candidates during the height of the campaign that resulted to more than 20+ million data points. And finally, a social network analysis of more than almost 40,000 comments, as well as 6,000+ replies to those comments during the campaign period. In that particular survey that we've conducted, we were able to somehow approximate, although this is of course, given the limitations of online surveys and the limitations that this survey was conducted with almost a year after the 2016 elections. So we were able to build a very preliminary picture of who is the online Filipino voter. In our sample, we saw that most of them could be classified as part of the lower middle class. A lot of them got college education. They are obviously young, with a median age of 29. And these online voters are primarily Facebook users, by the way. So we focused on Facebook as the social media platform. And of course, this is justified because Facebook is the most patronized or used social media application in the Philippines today. Although I'll share with you some data that somehow YouTube has edged Facebook in the latest survey. 86% said that Facebook is very important, or at least important, in their decision to vote in 2016. So in other words, the Filipino voter online more likely are younger, educated more so, and more likely to find information on Facebook truthful and see the value of Facebook as an important social media tool. We then, out of our major sample, we took all those who have expressed support for Duterte in the 2016 elections, and then we correlated it with some of our demographic factors. And then we were able to craft a picture of the Duterte fan or the Duterte voter. In 2016, the Duterte voter would more likely be poorer, quite religious, has expressed voting for Duterte quite early as January or early February. So you might say that the debates didn't really somehow made an imprint, particularly with Duterte voters, because they've already made their minds way ahead in the beginning of the election campaign. They tend to have voted with their entire family. So there's a collective, a force multiplier. But we also found out in some of our questions that they're not simply keyboard warriors, but they're also politically active offline. One particular behavior that we have observed, and you might notice this with the encircled part of this homophily analysis of all the data points, the 20 plus million data points that I mentioned earlier, that they tend to cluster in one part. This simply means that when we analyzed all the official Facebook pages of the 5 major candidates, a particular behavior for those who have expressed support for Duterte. That particular behavior refers to that they were not simply on Facebook to like the pages of their preferred candidates, unlike, for example, supporters of Rojas, Poe, Binay, as well as Miriam Defensor Santiago, but they actively went, if I'm a Duterte fan or supporter, for example, I just don't spend my time online on Facebook, just simply on Duterte's official page. In fact, what we observed is that of all the 5 candidates, Duterte's Facebook page was the least professionalized of all. It had very few posts. It almost did not have the clean, the neat, and the well-structured Facebook pages of other candidates. However, it outmatched all the other official Facebook pages in terms of engagement. Because not only were the posts in the official Facebook page of Duterte instantly shared, and it kind of diffused at a larger pace and a speedier pace, but there's this kind of other behavior, and that behavior is reflected by this clustering. That if you notice, the red dots represent the Duterte fans, and they're all over. This refers to some of the engagements within the other Facebook pages of the other candidates. So it means that Duterte fans or Duterte supporters make their way to go to the other official Facebook pages, not only to negatively campaign against the other candidates, but to promote Duterte. It's like they're trying to convince those who are supporting for the other candidates on those other Facebook pages to vote for Duterte. Now, for us, that was indicative of zeal. But for some of the reviewers of our output, that was also an indication of paid trolls. In a way, there is a fine line, and further studies need to be warranted in the distinction between overzealous armies of true believers as well as paid trolls. But this preliminary research reveals that there are certain kinds of behavior of Duterte supporters that we might likely see in the 2022 elections. So what makes social media a very potentially powerful campaign tool? It's relatively cheaper. According to Mr. Herman, who is a persuasion specialist and a political strategist, it's relatively cheaper. According to his modest budget, you need around 4.5 million pesos monthly for a social media campaign of a national candidate. But I don't believe in that. I see that it is highly underestimated, because that might be a legitimate social media campaign budget of 4.5 million. Because I've heard that budgets can go as high as 100 to 200 million for a national social media campaign strategy. They're relatively accessible, as I will show later. They're highly flexible because unlike TV or radio ads, wherein they have to be played in prime time to get more mileage, this can all be blasted on social media on a regular basis. And this could be done automatically. It's highly iterative, paulit-ulit. It's highly clandestine. Given the relative lack of regulatory infrastructure, politicians could have it's like an iceberg, a tip of the iceberg social media campaign, but there is an underneath social media strategy that is behind the shadows, that is in the dark area, and we don't necessarily have information. If you are a candidate that uses fake news and disinformation for you or against your other candidate, there could be plausible deniability. You can instantly say that, oh, it's not me, it's my supporters. This is the grassroots. I don't have control. It's like terrorist cells. I don't have control over all the other cells that are trying to be zealous supporters. And they're instantly, as Comelec regulations would reveal, they're insulated from regulation. Now let me go through the social media universe of the Philippines. In the recent We Are Social survey, it was revealed here that there were almost 74 million internet users in the Philippines in January 2021. This number increased by 6.1% since last year. There are 4.2 million more internet connected Filipinos than the year before. Internet diffusion in the Philippines is at 67%, which corresponds, it's a robust finding to the latest Pulse Asia survey that reveals that 63% of their survey said that they have internet connection. Of the different platforms, it is the mobile phone that is the main device to access the internet, with almost 99% saying that they own a mobile phone. And that 11 hours were spent on the internet on average daily by Filipinos, compared to 3 hours and 30 minutes on TV and 47 minutes on radio. So in a way, but you can be on your phone looking at the internet, but watching TV or listening to the radio at the same time. So the use of the media might not be mutually exclusive. In terms of social media use, there is an astounding 89 million social media users in the Philippines in January 2021. Whether or not these are 89 distinct Filipinos is another question, and we know troll farms and bots, so this 89 might be an overestimate with a lot of trolls, and a lot of Filipinos, not even trolls, a lot of Filipinos have multiple Facebook accounts, for example. This is an increase of an astounding 16 million from last year, and the number of social media users equates to almost 81% of the total population, this 89 million in 2021. As I mentioned earlier that Facebook is the most used social media platform, but as you can see here, YouTube edged Facebook by just a little percentage. But I do think a lot of Filipinos use YouTube for other purposes. Like I was told, like listening to music has become the primary use of YouTube, more than, for example, when you go on Facebook, you're actually there to get more information. In the Pulse Asia survey that corresponds to this We Are Social report, 99% of the respondents said they have social media accounts. Another 99% of those surveyed that they have internet access said that they use messaging apps like Facebook Messenger, Viber, or WhatsApp. But only 20%, according to the Pulse Asia survey, said that they talk about politics. Maybe because it's toxic, maybe because what you have is polarization within households. But the Pulse Asia survey reveals that social media messenger apps are not really the platforms for political discussion. Or I guess sometimes in families, you don't want to talk about politics given your divergent views. Just like elections, a lot of Filipinos, the Philippines is the top country of all the countries surveyed by the We Are Social report who follows influencers with much zeal. So in elections, we elect personalities. In social media, we rely on influencers a lot. We are 30% above the world average in terms of social media users following influencers. The implication is that influencers hold a lot of power. They have become arbiters of what is important and sometimes even what is truthful in social media. I want to also make the case that it varies in terms of social media apps. In terms of advertising, and this is important in elections because this includes political ads, Twitter only is able to reach around 8 million Filipinos, Twitter users, while Facebook is able to reach 83 million. So if I'm a politician and I want to embark on a social media campaign, my SOCMED app of choice will definitely be Facebook, given its reach. And Twitter has become more socially responsible in its political ads, and I think it has we know that it has banned Donald Trump at the height of the elections, and it has become more proactive in regulating social media usage. However, in that same We Are Social media survey, 57% of respondents said that they have expressed concern on about what is fake in the elections. And in terms of the surveys of, this is from SWS on your left-hand side, there is also an increasing belief that the internet is rife with fake news, and it has become a problem in the Philippines. We know that at present, Comelec does not have the necessary regulatory tools in order to completely regulate and police social media. As for now, they can monitor social media spending, which has already started, but they will likely release, I am looking forward to reading the social media regulations that they will release for the upcoming campaign. But they said that the main hurdle is that there is no law, and that the current Omnibus Election Code, as well as the Fair Elections Act, do not cover social media campaigning. So this is a big black hole in electoral campaign regulation. I'd like to direct you to 3 added electoral integrity threats posed by social media campaigning. On your left side, it's the prospect of micro-targeting, meaning unlike maybe in 2016 or 2019 in our elections, the disinformation will not be generally diffused or disseminated, but they will target particular groups. And how is the targeting going to be done? This is because social media apps have harvested a lot of our profile information. The more that you like things, the more that you feed these social media apps of your quirks, of what makes you riled up, or what makes you emotional. And according to existing studies, the more that we are emotionally outraged, the more that we are disinformed, the more that we are polarized, the better consumers of social media that we are going to be, because the more that we will likely engage with social media, right? Rather than looking at information in a cold balance sheet, in a rational way, the more emotive we are, and the more that the posts activate some of our emotions, the more likely that we will comment, we will share, we will lobby, and we will go to other people and say, read this, because this is quite important. This micro-targeting will be based on what kinds of information will likely lead certain groups to vote for a certain candidate, even if this information will likely be not true. On the right side, you have the advent of deepfake videos. This is quite troubling because this is generated through machine learning and through artificial intelligence. That there could be fake videos of, they could be politicians themselves saying bad things when they haven't done that at all, or endorsers, or this could be acts that could make them more palatable to voters. So deepfakes, the Senate has tried to embark on investigating this, but this is a threat to electoral integrity. And finally, and this is a bit scary, because if there is low regulatory infrastructure on general apps like Facebook, what more messenger apps, wherein it's not public, meaning if you have a group chat and someone is spreading fake news there, this is not spread publicly. It's only spread among the members and because of this, even social media apps have not stepped up their regulation of fake news within messenger apps. And the fourth, and I think for me, it's a bit troubling, they're all troubling, but the prospect of foreign interference and foreign influence. The Cambridge Analytica debacle revealed that more than 1.8 million Filipino Facebook users' data has been part of the breach by Cambridge Analytica. Who knows how this data is now currently being used for this upcoming campaign. And not only that, is that foreign influence could come from all sides. It could come from different countries, just like as we have seen in the US elections with the Russian interference. They could be foreign entities, or they could be Filipino politicians themselves hiring foreign firms like Cambridge Analytica to embark on foreign influence and foreign interference. Now, what are the social media apps doing? Facebook has recently said, they have an office here in the Philippines, have said that they have a library of political ads wherein people can check how much spending a particular candidate has done in terms of putting up political ads. Twitter said that its experience with other elections has made it more capable of addressing disinformation and fake news. But we all know that there is a conflict of interest here. Social media campaigning will likely get more engagement. Social media apps thrive on engagement. So unless the state comes in and basically lays out the rules for these tech media companies, self-limitation and self-regulation will neither be will be not necessary but insufficient. My last slide concerned some policy action as well as initiatives in combating fake news and disinformation in the upcoming elections. And I divided them into immediate and long-term. As I've said, we look forward to the Comelec social media campaign regulations. This is not just for any government agency, but more so, I think, for all of us citizens. Make fake news a campaign issue. Ask tough questions about fake news to candidates and what is their stand on this. I also want to suggest an electoral integrity compact against disinformation among all candidates and political parties. It might be informal, but at least we have the means of making them, holding them to account or making them answerable just in case they perpetuate disinformation. Let there be multiple citizen-led disinformation trackers. We know that the Pharmalead scandal has brought into attention citizen budget trackers. So why can't there be a citizen disinformation tracker? Let traditional or mass media companies pull together and come up with a consortium against fake news, particularly with the elections. And finally, a constant dialogue with social media companies. Long-term initiatives would be to amend existing electoral laws, a law against foreign interference and foreign influence, something that our neighboring countries have already embarked. I know that New Zealand and Australia have pretty stringent foreign interference and foreign influence laws, giving their own experience in the influence of foreign entities in their campaigns, a robust regulatory framework, and possibly a carrot and stick mechanism for social media companies on disinformation. Maybe we can talk about a fake news disinformation tax. If a social media commits a lot of disinformation and it's not able to police it, then the government can impose. I know that there is a bill that has been approved, but I think it's only in one chamber of taxing, EVAT, taxing media companies. But maybe we can also ask them that as a form of not sanction, right? A tax. We must also compel social media companies to share the data that they have harvested from us. And finally, and this is the for the really long term, maybe a campaign for data rights, for the rights that we have given this, for the data that is ours, and that we deserve compensation because social media companies have harvested this data. We have not read the fine print and is making a profit, undue profit, over our own data. That's it. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Aries Arugay. As we heard, social media has huge potential for promoting good candidates and good advocacies, but also huge potential for harm. The biggest being disinformation spreading widely and wildly on social media. The efficiencies and economies of scale make it highly effective for good and bad. And he's pointed out that there are practices that threaten democracy, and we need to hold the big social media companies to task. But we know that right now, Facebook, for example, is facing scrutiny from inside. No, there's been what's called the Facebook papers, where revelations from insiders indicate that Facebook really encourages hate speech, disinformation, because they bring in the profits. So thank you to our three speakers for your insights and the research you've done on these topics. There's so much to unpack from the lectures we've heard. And to help us process these lectures, we'd like to call on three distinguished reactors. We have Dr. Paul Hutchcroft Hutchcroft of the Australian National University, Comelec's James Jimenez, and former Comelec Commissioner Luie Guia. First, Professor Paul Hutchcroft is a scholar of comparative and Southeast Asian politics who has written extensively on Philippine politics and political economy. He is a professor at the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University and was from 2009 to 2013 the founding director of the School of International Political and Strategic Studies, now called Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs. Dr. Hutchcroft, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Rimban, for that kind introduction. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. It's good to see many dear friends. Matagal na hindi ako makapunta sa Pilipinas, so we'll have to make do with Zoom and just see you from afar and look forward to the day that we can cross paths again. I want to thank UP CIDS and the organizers for inviting me to join this conversation here today. And I am particularly honored, Jorge, that you called me a Department Suki of the Department of Political Science at the University of the Philippines. It's only appropriate today that the mug I'm using is the centennial mug of UP Diliman from 2015. So I hope that just proves I'm Suki, and it's great to be able to join you here today. So I'm going to start in the same order that we had the presentations. I first want to speak in most detail about the comments of my good friend, Professor Tigno, and then move into comments on the presentation of Professor Franco, and then the topic that I know least about, I will have the least to say, but the most questions for Dr. Arugay, I think. So I think the problem, Jorge, is there's too much that we agree on for me to offer much of a critique, but I do want to offer some comments along two lines. First of all, potential content of reform proposals, and then just as importantly, the process, because you've gotten into some very interesting issues of process and the degree to which a lot of reforms may not require a constitutional amendment. But starting with content, as you have in your written comments, I think that proposals that have been out there for the longest time to strengthen the party system without touching electoral system reform have just shown that they're not going anywhere. And even if they did pass, I think there's big questions as to how much difference they would make. They're very prescriptive and don't touch the underlying incentives that are found in the electoral system. And let's face it, the 1987 of the electoral system that's embodied in the 1987 Constitution is pretty much guaranteed to perpetuate weak and poorly institutionalized political parties. So when you just sort of mandate parties, you should be programmatic, or you shouldn't spend too much money when we know how difficult it is to regulate campaign finance. You shouldn't be turncoats, for heaven's sake. I mean, how do you regulate these sorts of things in any effective way? So those proposals, I think it would be useful just to say they're a thing of the past, they haven't gone anywhere, and even if they had, they probably wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference in the first place. So when we look at content, I think one of the first things to highlight is the need to deal with the issue of intra-party competition. Anytime you have competition among candidates from the same party, that pretty much guarantees that they won't be differentiating themselves on a platform if there were effective platforms in the first place, but they'll be using other mechanisms and most importantly, patronage to try to differentiate themselves. Now, where do we find intra-party? Oh, first of all, we know that intra-party competition has been a problem in many other settings, including elsewhere in the region, and that there has been electoral system reform in places like Japan and Thailand back in the day to try to address this and to strengthen political parties by getting rid of that problem. Now, where do we find inter-party competition in the Philippines? Pretty much ubiquitous. Of the 18,000 candidates that are elected every 3 years, 80% of those, according to Nico Ravanilla in our 2019 Electoral System Redesign book, come from something called the multi-member plurality system. This is found in the Senate. This is found in provincial, city, town councils. This is the most important segment of the Philippine electoral system, and it promotes inter-party competition, which is by definition undermining the character and quality of political parties. Secondly, as already mentioned by Joji, the non-proportional nature of the party list system. It leads to extreme splintering of the party list system, and this is highlighted very clearly in the chapter of Julio Tihanki, also in our electoral system book, and it effectively ghettoizes the smaller and more programmatic political parties. So I won't say any more about that. There's much you can say about this dysfunctional system, except that there's nowhere else in the world that you will find this very, very strange creature of the Philippine party list system. I think very much on our minds right now is executive posts. And as already noted, there could be great advantages in electing president and vice president as part of a single ticket. To my knowledge, the only place outside the Philippines that has this odd system of separate election of executive and vice executives is Texas. Say no more. Why go with the same system as a place like Texas? Now, not to be forgotten in all of this as well is the way in which you touched on this, Joji, in your suggestion for going to a majoritarian system. Now, there could be major virtue in moving to a two-round system, such as found in France and Indonesia. And in a two-round system, you have to get 50% of the vote. And if no one gets it in the first round, you go into a second round. And think what a difference that would make right now in advance of the 2022 elections. If all the major candidates knew ultimately they needed to get 50% of the votes, it would change completely these dynamics of the free-for-all that we're seeing right now. Elections are always unpredictable, they should be, but this is a particularly unpredictable process when someone can win with 23.6% of the vote, as Fidel Ramos did in 1992. So when everyone knows that they can win with a very small plurality, it encourages more people to pile in, and that's what we got right now, just an incredible number of candidates. Other advantages of a two-round system is that you ensure a stronger mandate. Someone comes into office with the 50% majority, not just a plurality. More I could say, including on issues of term limits, but I think I'll set that aside for now. In terms of process, as you pointed out, Joji, in your paper, it is an inherently political process to engage in electoral system reform. We can bring in all the technical experts we want, but it is really going to always involve politicians who, as a rule, are going to see advantages to the system on which they were voted into office, and therefore be conservative about switching to a new system. So it doesn't happen very often to go to a major electoral system reform, but we do have examples from other countries where the stars align, or to put it in somewhat more technical terms, as Alan Hicken points out in our volume, you have a combination of systematic failure, a perception that the system as a whole is failing, as there was in Japan in the late 80s and early 1990s. There's some sort of catalyst for change, and there's some kind of motivations on the part of politicians. Either they think a new system would be better for them, or they're being pressured so heavily by public opinion. And so all of these things make it difficult. You do note in your paper, Joji, an important role for congressional leadership. And I would, just as a supplement to that, highlight a very important role for presidents. I think it's critical that you have an executive that is pushing for constitutional revision. And without that, it's very difficult to get it through. But that executive also has to be seen as somewhat of a disinterested party promoting political reform, as Ramos was not, as Arroyo was not, and someone who has some clear ideas, as we have not found from Duterte. I mean, what did he say in July of 2019? We should amend the Constitution to federalism or whatnot. The idea that you do something for the sake of doing it. You have to have very clear ideas, and it has to. I think there needs to be a clear push from the executive. But until there is that strong push from a presidential administration, it would be very difficult to get the necessary momentum for constitutional revision. So in the meantime, that's why I was really excited about some of your ideas, Joji, both in your paper and your comments, to look for what can be congressionally legislated, especially if there's no major momentum for constitutional reform. Now, you mentioned what can be done in the Electoral Code. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert on these things, but as I understand, there's some important elements in the Local Government Code that could be examined as well, with the caveat, Dr. Jorge Tigno has highlighted that the Local Government Code is quasi-constitutional. It's so set in stone that it's not an easy thing to open up and amend either. And I think it's also very important at this juncture in history to look at lessons from the New Bangsamoro autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, which arguably has some of the most innovative proposals for new electoral system found at any point in recent Philippine history. Now, there's a lot of details to be worked out in their electoral code as well, but these are some very important innovations that are worth looking at. It is election season, and now is a really good time to put forward the kind of public education campaign that you were highlighting, Joji. We did that in a series of Rappler articles back in 2016 with articles from Ben Riley and Soc Reyes and Ramon Casiple, looking at different ways. People are thinking about the elections now, so now's the time to be putting forth some political education on these important issues, and how small changes in the electoral system can have a huge impact in how politics is done, both positive and negative. We've got plenty of negative lessons from Indonesia in terms of some of their recent changes. So it is a political process, and I think it's critical that you work with the stakeholders that are there to try to get them excited about what might happen. I like the way that Julio Tejanqui framed it in our volume, to improve on the party list system, move it from 20% to 40%, make it truly proportional, and take what has had some positive impact and make it better. I'm probably taking too much time. I'll move on quickly to your very comprehensive analysis of women's representation, Jean. And it is indeed depressing that 30% international political benchmark has not been reached. And it certainly is worth noting, as you say, worth considering, as you say, examples from other countries. You talk about advantages of proportional representation and zipper system, and more specifically, it's a closed list proportional representation with zipper arrangements, as very strongly urged by Soc Reyes in our 2019 volume, that can have some of the most important impact, or what works for women, as she has in the title of her chapters. And these things work across cultural contexts. It's not just Northern European democracies that are able to increase the number of women. If these institutional arrangements are put in place in places like Bolivia and Rwanda, then it has a has had a very positive impact. Rwanda has had some of the highest percentages of women in politics. The only other thing I'd say, Jean, is just some recent work in a project that I've overseen at the Australian National University, looking at exactly these issues of substantive representation in Indonesia, candidate strategies, both at the national and subnational level, what it takes not just to get women into legislative bodies, but to bring about the kind of substantive representation that you speak of with better social welfare outcomes. Also, some surveys on attitudes of women in politics, similar to what you referenced, that show highly patriarchal attitudes. So we know that those are a key barrier, as you have highlighted. Finally, thanks to Aries for highlighting all of these dangers, quite depressing, but I'm glad you ended, Aries, in terms of looking at policy actions that might be considered. I just have two questions for you, Aries. One, when you mentioned the foreign interference in the the dangers of foreign interference in the 2022 election. And how that looms large in our thinking about these issues. I'm wondering if you can say, what is the state of our current knowledge about foreign interference in 2016? I know that there's been a lot of speculation, but what do we know about who was involved and what the key mechanisms were? Also looking back at that previous election, as we're all waiting with bated breath to find out whether the Marcoses and the Dutertes are going to cut a deal and come up with a common ticket. I think it's useful also to look back some of the collaborations that were taking place between the Marcoses and the Dutertes in 2016. And this is outside my ken, but as I have heard, please correct me if I'm wrong, so this is a question, were not the Marcoses very important in providing some of the basic foundation for the Duterte social media effort? That whole effort they had back in 2014-15, which they were trying to make Mas Bango the public perceptions and the golden era of the Philippines and all that sort of thing. Were some of those efforts the foundations for the Dutertes in 2016? I've heard such things, but you would know these things better than almost anyone else. So those are my questions. I'm sorry I went on, Dr. Rimban, but a few things to throw out for our subsequent discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchcroft, for your reaction. For those who have questions, you can please post them on the Q&A and we'll try to have the speakers answer them. In the meantime, let's move on to Comelec spokesperson James Jimenez, the head of the Education and Information Department of the Comelec. He's what he calls himself now. He calls himself the official talking head of the Comelec, the voice and the face of the commission. He has a regular program on Comelec Hour DZRH every Saturday afternoon. Director Jimenez, the floor is yours. Is he? Where's James?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Rimban. First of all, I feel very much out of my depth. I'm looking at Dr. Paul Hutchcroft here, and I'm thinking what he said, right? And that's basically everything that needs to be said about these presentations. However, I'm going to go in a different order from him. I'm going to start with what I know best, and end up with the thing that I actually was part of in terms of the research. So let's talk about social media. I understand from what Aries said was that there's a lot of expectation, there's a lot of anticipation for the Comelec social media guidelines. Please do not expect too much. This is a bit of management of expectations, I think, when I say that the largest problem is exactly what Dr. Arugay said. There is no legislative framework for any of this. The Comelec is like really blazing a trail in this respect. And the problem with that is when you're the first one through the wall, you're the one ending up with a bloody face. And that's exactly the kind of situation the Comelec is finding itself in. There are a lot of initiatives, however, and one of the things that I would like to specifically point out is something that Dr. Arugay mentioned as well as one of the flashpoints or the future problems that he's foreseeing for the use of social media, and that is micro-targeting. One of the things that we are going to come out with in our social media guidelines is actually a prohibition political candidates from using micro-targeting as a means of deciding where to send their posts, how to boost or promote their posts. So we're looking very closely at micro. Dr. Arugay mentions something about deep fakes as being a potential pitfall for the coming elections. We totally recognize this. And in fact, we have an integrity pledge. And in the integrity pledge, there is a section there that deals specifically with cyber hygiene, as well as a rejection of the use of misinformation, including the use of deep fakes. And yes, we specifically mentioned deep fakes. Now, finally, I'd like to mention that yes, YouTube is actually overtaking Facebook as a social media app of choice. And the reason for that is that YouTube is full of fake news. YouTube is actually where a lot of people get their get the content that they in turn amplify on other social media. The thing with YouTube is that you're able to post long form content that allows people to actually have something to use as their content, right? They're taking the information that they're getting from YouTube and they're parsing it for social media, for other microblogging sites. Now, the thing about YouTube is that it is being used mostly by influencers, I suppose you could call them. Persons who are able to insert themselves into broadcasts and in the middle of a broadcast appear to be part of the broadcast, but giving editorial content. Basically, they're taking news from the day and putting it in the proper context for their followers. This then acts as a source for everything else that follows afterwards. One of the most interesting things that you might notice when you're tracking social media disinformation is how a lot of the social media disinformation that you see can actually be tracked back to a video that was uploaded hours or even days before that sort of misinformation starts gaining traction on Facebook and Twitter. So I think there's a lot of work to be done to look exactly at how Facebook is being used in order to spread and originate misinformation. So thank you very much, Dr. Arugay. That was an incredibly enlightening talk. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how our social media guidelines will measure up to your expectations. But again, please don't hold your breath too much. You might be disappointed. Again, Comelec is working under a massive handicap in the sense that even if we did come out with guidelines as we did in 2016, we're doing so basically with the anticipation that we're going to get hied off to the Supreme Court. That's actually what we're hoping for, because it seems like that's the only way we can get it to be talked about in official capacities, right? Congress has many times taken a hard pass on actually drafting social media rules. Dr. Franco, thank you very much for your presentation as well. I'd like to tell you that the Comelec has a strong gender and development committee, and we're very much aware of the rights of women and the participation of women in politics. However, if I may be frank, I think one of the biggest problems is that in many cases, the institutional guardians of gender equality are themselves gender biased. So you see things like gender champions actually, buying into traditional gender norms or gender roles. And that sort of dilutes the power of their position, because basically they tend to reflect old patriarchal beliefs, right? So instead of pushing harder for gender equality, they end up saying, but what about men's rights? Which is, again, something that you would find very ironic from someone who is supposed to champion gender rights. And finally, regarding the presentation of Dr. Tigno, of course, we totally agree that overdue. That in fact we did try to start some work on that before 2010, actually. As early as 2007, we were already talking about political party reform. But as I told Dr. Tigno, that seemed to have lost some steam with the results of the presidential elections in 2010. It felt, for those of us who were on the ground, that priorities had shifted, and that for some reason, political party reform was suddenly on the back burner. But that remains very important, and we still feel the consequences of that decision not to pursue political party reform, among which are, of course, the continuing drama about substitution, right? Substitution is an innocuous remedy. The problem is that the propensity of our candidates to play political butterflies is what's driving the drama. Precisely because you don't know when anyone will turn, you're fueling speculation about who's going to run and who isn't, and that is prolonging really this whole negotiation stage, which, let's be frank, should have been done long before the filing of COC. So yes, political party reform is long overdue, as is, I believe, desynchronization of the elections, as Professor Tigno pointed out. Synchronization is might have been a good idea at some point, but right now it makes everything very difficult. In fact, synchronization is one of the major objections to the whole idea of having runoff elections, right? While we can realistically implement a runoff system, when you think about the mechanics of it and the logistics of it, you realize that you probably don't want to do that. Because having runoff elections means you're going to have two full-fledged national elections with all of the costs that entails, precisely because it is synchronized. So that's really what puts it beyond the reach of any argument on practicability. But again, like I said, we must be very honest about it. Political party reform is absolutely necessary. But I would also add that we need to also must be taken in tandem with political party reform moving forward. Thank you very much. I hope that helped.
Thank you very much, Director Jimenez, for your reaction. I now move to our last speaker. Attorney Luie Tito Guia is a former election commissioner appointed in April 2013 and stepped down on February 2, 2020. As a commissioner, he chaired the committees on Indigenous peoples voting by persons deprived of liberty, and persons with disability. And he was in charge of overseas voting at certain periods in his tenure. He currently teaches at De La Salle University. Attorney Luie Tito Guia, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank UP and UP-CIDS for inviting me. Thank you so much. And it's nice to see old colleagues and friends, Dr. Jorge, of course, Dr. Paul. The last time we saw each other was when you launched the book that is quoted very generously in this webinar. Now, one thing good about being the last speaker is that I can always say that Dr. Paul Hutchcroft and James Jimenez have already said all the necessary reaction to the excellent presentation. In fact, I have been hearing this, but I still was taken aback by the revelation in the presentation of Dr. Aries. Ganun pala yun, no? Grabe. Now, but maybe what I can add to Dr. Aries' presentation as to this information is that, it's not just this information as against, competing candidates. It's also this information about the integrity of democracy and election and the electoral process as a whole. Because if you are able, if this information is able to remove the trust of the people to electoral democracy, then that is even worse. They might find maybe alternative way of changing government or holding their government accountable, more practical and more, more available than, let's say, election. If we continue to, if we allow this information to happen against the process. Of course, there are a lot of things that can be said against the process, but most of the evidence of this information, especially in 2016, and Dr. James, Director James Jimenez will attest to this, are actually, there are a lot of disinformation also about things that are supposed to have happened, but actually did not happen. And these are motivated, obviously, by partisan interests, but the damage is done not only to the reputation of those they are targeting, but to the electoral process. And there we have even experienced, continuing a narrative that has been explained just to maintain the support, the basis for support for a political position. So yan din, no? Let's look at the impact of this information to the electoral process, to electoral democracy as a whole. Of course, much has been said about political parties, and I'm invested on it because I was part of an effort way back in 2002, whereby we gathered civil society group, a coalition of civil society group, gathered all political parties from Lakas, LDP, NP, even I think KBL was there, and there was an agreement to reform and develop strengthened political parties. The objective of the forum was actually to look at the use of money and politics, and it gravitated towards a discussion of improving or developing and strengthening political party as a way to make the use of money and politics more transparent and easier to regulate. So the connection between money and politics and a better political party system is really something that has been recognized as early as 2003. It was actually in 2003 that the first bill filed by all parties, almost all parties, you have Joe de Benencia of Lakas, Angara of LDP, filing the same bill. Because if you remember, at that time, it was supposedly a window for reform when then President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo said that she was not running. And I think the momentum changed when suddenly she said that she was running, at the last minute. And from that time on, I think political party reform initiative have never gone off substantially. But I will not discuss that anymore because taking the cue from, of course, I consider him my mentor, Dr. Paul Hutchcroft. No matter what you do with pushing, a political party law under this system, then not much can be achieved anyway. So I actually agree that, looking at the PR system or looking at a PR system as an alternative would be a good a step in the right direction. And we have a PR system. People do not recognize that. Many do not recognize that we actually have a PR system. Our party list system representation is a proportional representation system misunderstood and misinterpreted earlier on. And that is the problem why we got things wrong. We look at it, we looked at the party list system as a reserved seat system, it is not a reserved seat system. So yun yung mga naging problema. And that's why we're having problems with interpretation from the time that the law was passed up to, I think, even at this point in time. Even Comelec have had its problem in interpreting and implementing the law. And that's why I think it's important to revisit the law, because these are things that you can do without really amending the Constitution. Dr. Paul Hutchcroft mentioned about the BARM electoral systems design. I even, proposed that when I was doing some political party training work in the BARM after my retirement, I even proposed that the election in the BARM should be held in 2022 so that it can showcase what kind of benefit that mixed system would have, and it can even be a model for adoption for our national legislator. You mixed system, you have single member district representation, and you have the proportional representation, the real proportional representation, rather than what we have, which I think is really weird. We are the only country with a proportional representation that has a cap and do not have a threshold. Other countries would necessarily have threshold, but they do not have caps. So, but I think we relish in the fact that we are unique, and we are even proud of it, except that some political scientists outside the country are actually laughing at us for being proud of things that we actually got very, very wrong. Okay, so yes, we need to update our electoral code, and I think I need to emphasize this. The core election law that we have is a 1985 vintage election law. Remember, take note, an election law that even came before the 1987 Constitution, designing a system that should be implemented. So makikita niyo yung disconnect between the constitutional requirement and the election law. So the Constitution says multi-party system, no, but our election law does not really, its procedure are not really geared towards a multi-party system. So reforms are actually necessary. As early as 1993, Comelec itself, I was in Comelec as a staff member at that time, Comelec itself proposed a new election code as early as 1993. But what happened then was that Congress did not see that, passing a whole election code makes sense. So what happened is that yung piecemeal lang ang pinasa. So you have the party list law, you have the Continuing Registration Act. Later on, you have the Overseas Voting Act. And in that law, there was even a proposal to take away withdrawal as a ground for substitution. Remember, if these laws were already passed as early as that point, many of the problems that we are, we're being noisy about right now would have been solved. I'm not sure, but we usually complain about things when they're there, but we do not see them when they're not yet there. Okay, of course, having an election code would make our antiquated provisions, electoral code provisions, adapt to maybe new technology, to the phenomenon of social media, to even new election paradigm which focuses on a more voter-centric, competitive electoral process. And even the way election administration is done should be transformed from that of which, Comelec proceeds from a position of authority and the only expert in election to one that is more collaborative and more engaging, because that is how governance should be practiced in the modern world. But the old framework has never been changed. Now, I would like to just as a last point to comment on what Dr. Tigno said about some of the reforms. Well, adopting a majoritarian system in our constitution might be a challenge because there is this perception that our constitution only mandates a plurality voting. but I think there has to be a revisit of that interpretation. And but here's another thing: the interpretation that the vice president should be elected separately from the president seem to be cast in the language of the Constitution. So there is this perception that you cannot, make an interpretation that they should be elected jointly. Okay, and synchronization of election. That the synchronization of election is actually a constitutional requirement in the it is in the transitory provision of the Constitution, and we know the reason why that was put in the Constitution, but a more flexible legal framework would be more advisable, I think. That is so that you can give Comelec some degree of flexibility to adapt to changes, no. But of course, you have to impose on it some responsibility if it does some mischief. As Omnibus Election Code was crafted at that time, that there was so much mistrust in the martial law years and Comelec at that time. So anyway, so that's it. As to the presentation of Dr. Franco, yes, it's good to have been presented a lecture that has been been given to me constantly by Commissioner Bing Guanzon, and I agree that the only way by which gender women participation in politics would be to increase would be to improve would be to through political parties, and perhaps a PR system might be better for women representation. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Guia, for your reaction. Time check, it's 3:56. We have time for a few questions and short answers from our speakers. First question from CNN, Paulo Barcelon. Many of the current presidential aspirants are running either as independents in the case of VP Lenny, or under what was once considered smaller or lesser known parties, BBM under Partido Federal ng Pilipinas, Isko Moreno under Aksyon Demokratiko. Can you get your thoughts on why such a move had to be done? Anyone who wants to answer that question very briefly, including from any of our reactors, please feel free to answer. Would anyone want?
Well, maybe quickly, because parties do not matter.
Very short soundbite. That's great, and that's right. What about Joji?
I totally agree with Attorney Luis' answer to the question. No? Parties don't matter. People create, individuals create parties, and it's not the other way around. What should happen, and I think Paul agrees with me on this, is that it's the parties that should create the candidates. It's the parties that should push for the candidates and not the other way around. So what we're seeing here is a phenomenon where the candidates themselves create their own parties. They basically tailor their own clothes, for themselves.
Dr. Arugay?
Yes, because parties are not sunk investments in the Philippines, meaning these are not institutions wherein politicians can the exit is too high, meaning in other countries a career outside their political party is unthinkable. It's a death sentence. So, but I think others are also doing the same, particularly in this upcoming electoral cycle, is to depolarize the situation, because the existing parties are really has a lot of baggage, and using them perpetuates this pernicious polarization that we are in. So that could be and in a way then it becomes a good thing, because you're not trapped. That your party is forever within this vicious cycle of pernicious polarization. So it could work both ways. But I think in the interest of institution building, getting out of parties simply because to depolarize or to is short-term thinking and is not really looking pretty much in investing, making parties a TINA option, meaning there's no other alternative but to organize politics in accordance to parties.
Can I just second what Aries just said? No, I think what the point here is that we're looking at this as if this were normal. We should not look at this as normal. The people should not look at these kinds of things happening as something that they can passively accept. No? If they, exert their opposition to this kind of situation, then perhaps the politicians might be wary next time around, no? In doing this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for answering the question. Question number 2 is from Ina Reformina of ABS-CBN. Good afternoon. The context of electoral reforms, in the context of electoral reforms, question please for Director Jimenez. The Commission, on the latest activities of the Commission to trim down the long list of aspirants particularly for the 75% or 3/4 of aspirants for national posts are estimated to be nuisance candidates. David said a petition was already submitted by the Comelec Law Department for the purpose. Will it be Commission and Bank that will approve the petition, and when can we expect the decision to be made public? Director Jimenez, the question is for you. Is Director Jimenez still here? I can see him.
I think James got
disappeared.
disconnected. Yeah.
It got cut off. Anyway, we move on to the question was for him, so we move on to the next question. As discussions continue with the legislature on reforms, are there any new and recent recommendations from the Comelec insofar as nuisance candidates are concerned? The same question for James. Another question for Dr. Franco. In some cities, towns, the story of the 2022 elections will be about the first women to hold local posts if they win. Example, Hani Lacuna running for Manila mayor. How important is it for politicians to show that women are as capable as other genders in leadership positions? How should their consultants also not sell women candidates using the ate mother tita narrative?
Yeah, as I think I already responded to this, but I'd like to reiterate that electing women in politics brings women's issues in the political sphere, and they also serve a symbolic function in the sense that they are able to serve as models to future generation of young women. So it means that women in the political sphere gets to be normalized. Now, to the other question on the mother or tita narrative, anti-narrative in campaigns, I think it does not help the cause of women in general, since it subjects women into stereotypes. But this is not just true for the Philippines. This has been used by Marie Le Pen in France, Sarah Palin, for instance, in the US many years ago. And in fact, it also stereotypes women who do not actually, some of which do not actually want to be mothers, or who cannot be mothers. I understand that this is a campaign strategy to garner more votes, but what I'm saying is that it can have negative consequences. The better way to frame a woman candidate is to present the diverse roles of women in society rather than play on stereotypes.
Okay. Thank you for that, Jean. Does anyone else want to comment on women in electoral politics? Okay. We leave that question. That was posted in the chat earlier by Porfirio Calagon. How do we prevent the wanton bribery of voters, considering that Comelec is seemingly inutile? Well, this is a...
It's sorry, Lucy, it's too bad that James is
I
not
know,
here,
yeah.
to defend Comelec. But in his defense, no, I would think that the problem there is no one's complaining, no one's filing a case. You have to file a case. I mean, Comelec can just police. The Comelec is not the police. Okay, so it's not in a position to do that. You have to file a case for it, and an informed citizenry, an active citizenry is key. Is important here to address this problem.
Okay. Does anyone else? Yes, Dr. Arugay.
Yeah, one thing that we were not able to discuss, but I know that this has been part and parcel of the electoral reforms discourse, is campaign finance. And in a way, I think the bills on political party development, I know that Mon Casiple this has been his pet project since I've known him in my IPD days, that a discussion on campaign finance. But you're really talking about a difficult conversation because you're asking the prospect of the state funding political campaigns is, I think, a very difficult conversation to do right now at this particular juncture. But even before, I think, the mere fact that we would give money to politicians to carry out their campaigns, but we all know that that is only half of the equation. The other half is that because of this, politicians will be severely limited in seeking funding from others. But the biggest problem there is that the regulation of the status quo, meaning SOSE is declared, but it's another thing whether who are really being sanctioned for violations of overspending. And so the prospect now is that what more if it's taxpayers' money, right? However, this is all connected. I think campaign finance is connected to political party system development because you're giving the stake of the electoral process away from the rich and the well-born, but more directly to people themselves. But if you are not a card-carrying member of any political party, it would be very difficult for you to accept or to swallow the fact that I'm going to give part of my taxes to funding campaigns. So this idea of having a stake in a system that it's not a free lunch. Elections is not a free lunch. This is all part and parcel of Filipino citizenship. Is a difficult conversation, I may say. There's not a lot of takers, even if every Congress, there's a bill filed in the Committee on Electoral Reforms about campaign finance and political party system development.
Attorney Guia.
I just want to chime in on that because I was with Mon Casiple when we were pushing for campaign finance reform and political party reform together. And basically the problem was really like that. Bakit ka magbibigay ng pera sa mga magnanakaw? I mean just to dramatize to emphasize the point. So I think there's a need for the civil society to take a lead in creating a demand for political reform. And I think that is what Dr. Tigno was saying in his presentation, a bottoms-up approach to political reform. And it has to be done probably in the first term of the first half of the term of the presidency. It cannot be in the second half because that could not happen. So we're looking at whoever the president would be, probably. Well, it is important who the president would be, as pointed out by Dr. Hutchcroft. Maybe starting July, we should be talking about this already. Create a demand for political reform. It is that kind of reform has never been palatable. You talk about anti-corruption, anti-poverty, but you don't talk about the people who would implement these policies. And that is your electoral and political reform. And investing on good politics through subsidy perhaps might become would sound better if delivered, or if you create a demand, a clamor for it. So I think that's important. And by the way, I just got a list of the most number of electoral offenses that the Comelec is taking, is with the law department now, and it is overspending.
Oh. Okay, interesting. But you don't get to check the overspending until after the elections, right?
In fact, the reform that the Omnibus Election Code says that there has to be a report of expenditure 10 days before election. But that has been removed. Now you have to report only after the election. The proposal should be that there should be some kind of a baseline even before the campaign period.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Hutchcroft?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Issues of public campaign financing aside, I think it's just important to emphasize the inherent regulatory challenges of dealing with all the money that sloshes around in the middle of an election. I remember some years ago talking with an official of a major candidate who said, we get boxes of cash on our doorstep from business people you have never even heard of. There's just a lot of money out there in cash form. And so the whole idea that you can really regulate spending in that environment is it's a huge issue, to say the least. And that's why I think the more that there can be attention to the underlying incentives. Of course, to echo something that Joji said, there's no silver bullet in any of this, but if you can get more attention to issues rather than patronage and money, that is at least a start.
We'll hear now from Director Jimenez, who's back. Sir James, there's a question for you, and it's about bribery, vote buying.
Yeah.
What is Comelec doing? The question is, considering that Comelec seems to be inutile in this matter, what can be done? Or
really,
do you agree with?
the Comelec is not inutile in this matter. It's simply the reality of vote buying. See, the problem with people who say that the Comelec is inutile in this matter, actually, they just want Comelec to be able to spot disqualify people. Basically to say that if I catch you with money in your hand, you're disqualified, you're gone. That's not gonna happen. That's called due process, my friend. And you have to understand that before you say things like that. See, the problem with vote buying is that it is a matter of proof. You have to prove that vote buying occurred. How do you prove that with no witnesses, with no complainant? How do you prove that when you're not even present during the transaction? And how can you be present in the transaction when you have, what, 2 people in each city and municipality? This expectation that Comelec will be able to spot disqualify anyone, even suspected of vote buying, this is unrealistic. And it will never amount to anything, right? What are we doing about vote buying? What we're doing about vote buying is that we're trying to streamline the prosecution side of it. Because ultimately, that's really all you have to go on. What you need to do is you need to be able to facilitate the prosecution of alleged vote buyers. And you have to be able to push it through the judicial system fairly quickly. Because let me tell you this, even if you get someone in front of a judge on vote buying charges, due process means that they can push this calendar all the way to the limit, to the point that they could actually win the elections and serve out their terms before you get any sort of final decision from the courts. That's the problem. It's not the Comelec that's the problem. It's the due process that needs to be followed in order to get any sort of traction. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to facilitate and streamline prosecution. We're also looking at new frontiers. One of the biggest problems now confronting the Comelec in terms of the issue of vote buying is really the use of mobile payment apps. And we're talking to mobile payment app companies trying to find a solution. At this moment, even in other transactions, not necessarily election related, the use of mobile paying apps is already being flagged as a minefield, right? It's being used for drug transactions as well, which is why law enforcement in general is already looking at that. And we are also on the side of the Comelec. Unfortunately, Again, I'm sorry to say this, but much to the disappointment of everyone who wants instant disqualification, that's still not going to happen. And you're still not going to be able to prevent people from using money the way they want to use it. All you can do really is to find them and to catch them in the act of using it illegally. Then you have a fight, right? But again, as always, as with actual physical vote buying, you still need a complainant, you still need a witness, and you need someone who will stick with the case until the judge decides to convict, right? So these are the challenges facing us with vote buying. And again, like I said, it's a slog, it's a slog. But what we need to do is we need to work also on people and the politicians, right? So it's not just about enforcement of the law, it's also about an attitude change. You see, the problem is that too many people think that it's all right to participate in the system if you pretend to be principled about it, right? If you're able to convince yourself and everyone around you that you're going to vote your conscience, it's okay to take money, but you're already dipping your toe in the corruption, right? These things are connected. You twist the one, you taint the other, right? So there is no principled participation if it starts off with accepting a bribe. That's the Comelec position. We can argue about it all day if you want, but as far as the Comelec is concerned, we think that vote buying is wrong and that you should not even suggest it to people, that there's some sort of relativistic moral ground that you can stand on, because there is none as far as the Comelec is concerned, right? And number two, we should teach people not to reward the vote buyers, right? Vote buying is a strategy that is embedded in our culture because it works. That's the problem, right? As long as these people keep winning on the back of vote buying, they will keep doing it, right? Regardless of how much we flap our gums here, they're still gonna do it because it works. So we must not make it work. In other words, don't vote for people who buy votes. Over the past few weeks, I have witnessed this spectacular new development where people now say that anti-vote buying is anti-poor. This is ridiculous. Anti-vote buying is supposedly anti-poor because you're depriving people of the money that flows, the boxes of cash that Dr. Hutchcroft mentioned. You're depriving them of the opportunity to get that windfall. Again, this is ridiculous. This is ignorant, right? Vote buying itself is anti-poor because you are being bought off at the beginning at the expense of good governance 6 years, 3 years down the road. That is the real anti-poor aspect of vote buying.
Okay, so it's really massive voter education that's needed. Thanks for your answer. We have another question for you, Director Jimenez from ABS-CBN. In the context of electoral reform, on the latest activities of the Commission to trim down the long list of aspirants, particularly for national contests, Comelec EID's attorney David supposedly said, bared that around 75% of aspirants for national posts is estimated to be declared nuisance candidates. He said a petition was already submitted by the Comelec Law Department for this purpose. Will it be the Commission and Bank that will approve the petition, and when can we expect a decision?
Yes, it'll be the Commission that will decide on the question of nuisance. The final list of candidates, basically the decision, because you're not going to see the nuisance candidates there anymore, will probably be out middle of December. So the individual decisions will, of course, take will take different times, right? I mean, it's not all going to be one massive decision, as the cases will be tried separately, of course.
Okay.
So mid-December.
So Ina, I hope that answered your question.
Oh boy.
Another question from
yeah, mid-December. So that's when we expect the final list of candidates to be released.
Okay. The next question, perhaps this is the last question. What kind of reforms do we need for the Senate? Currently, we have one of, if not the highest population to upper house seats ratio. Lower house to upper house seats and Senate elections generally advantage the economic elite who have the means to campaign to more people. Do we need more seats, geographical party list representation, or both? Anyone who'd like to answer that question? Reforms in the Senate? Dr. Arugay?
It's tough. I mean, you know, when you are trying to reformat an entire institution, institutional inertia as well as pushback is real. And we're not just talking about a Senate. This is a co-equal branch of the legislature and is key to changing itself. It's like reforming the UN Security Council permanent members. You need their assent in order to be reformed. One key reform that has been explored is to making it regional, because it used to be regional. There was a point in our history wherein senators were elected regionally. Because at present, the Senate is like para siyang pinapag-practicean kung pwedeng maging presidentiable because of the national level constituency. And in terms of proportionality of representation, there's also a problem. You're talking about two chambers of the legislature, but in terms of representational scope, magkaiba. No? Very defined yun sa House. No? Party list group is supposed to be a sector. The House is in terms of a legislative district. The Senate gives, with its national level constituency, I think gives undue power to a lot of the senators. And then it makes it less coherent in terms of its policy-making role. The other way is, though this has its own dangers, because when you talk about institutional reform, there will always be unintentional consequences. The other aspect would be of changing it is to make it not unequal branch of government of the legislature. So in other countries that are other bicameral legislatures, those chambers are not equal, meaning there are certain powers given to the Senate, but not as much as the House, which is the more representative, right? Because if you're talking about 24 people representing the entire country, compared to around 300 plus, almost 400 on the House, there's really a difference in scope. We know that when the US Senate by design is to supposedly counteract the majoritarian and tyrannical tendencies of the House. I don't know if that is really the purpose that the Senate is able to do, but historically the Senate has been seen as the more conservative branch of the legislature that somehow puts a stopgap to whatever the House says. So in a way, it could be seen as a good thing, but we also see that, for me, it's really quite astounding that an entire dynasty could have 2 or more in terms of kinship seats in a 24-member body. That is just amazing. I don't know if there is any other body around the world, a legislature, that could match that representational domination.
Dr. Rakisa, and then Dr. Hutchcroft. You're muted, Dr. Rakisa.
Okay, so I agree with more or less with Aries, but I also would like to provide a counter argument, which is the fact that, you know, there's an incentive there for our senators to actually be and speak for the national interest. One of the things that we've also mentioned, like in terms of traditional politics, in terms of like even the political clans, while it is true that you actually have political clans in the Senate, that is also true in more so right now at the lower house, where you have political parties or political clans that are tied into economic interterritorial jurisdiction. So in other words, in many of the arguments or many of the bills, you will find alternative readings that will in fact reflect, at least push for a national vision. Also because as Aries mentioned, Dr. Arugay mentioned, it is aspiring for a higher office, right? So and so in a way, if you look at, and maybe this is a study, if you look at like what are the bills that are coming out in the lower house in Congress and in the Senate, when you go to the BICAM, you will actually have the Senate having a stronger push for a better bill than you will have from the lower house. And I would say, for instance, the question of the Senate bill on the retail trade that has now passed the BICAM. There was a real argument where how much are we going to allow foreign investors to come in and own retail retail outfits. So in that sense, I think we do need to study the issue more in terms of like what are, the Senate it has problems, but it also provides some space for the national interest to actually come in. That's it. Thank you.
Dr. Hutchcroft?
Yes, I'd also like to pick up on that virtue of the Senate having the national representation. But first, just to step back, this is a body that embodies, because of the electoral system, intra-party competition. So people are voting against each other and are running against each other in the election, so they are not differentiating themselves on the basis of policies or programs. The other thing about the Senate is just how it was said before, parties aren't important. Well, yeah, that's absolutely the case too in the Senate. When so often the slates that are put together aren't even identified by parties. They're teams and they're multi-party teams. So there's something very challenging for anyone who wants to build up stronger political parties. And Nico Ravanilia, in looking at data before 2019, noted that 19 out of the current 24 members of the upper house are dispersed across 8 parties, with the remaining 5 declaring themselves to be independent of any party affiliation. So how do you build any kind of programmatic basis out of that? I know there is talk of maybe moving to a regional system, but I would be very cautious about anything that could potentially encourage regional political parties. If there's one thing that we could say nice about Philippine political parties, and we all like to quote Nathan Kimpo on how there's not much nice that can be said about Philippine political parties, but if there's one thing we can say that's nice about Philippine political parties is they tend to be national in scope. And so that is something that is really important to try to preserve. If you go regional, it could lead to a splintering of the party systems. But there are some ways to work around this with creative constitutional engineering, and this is where you'd really want to bring in someone who's an expert on electoral systems around the world. But potentially you could adopt a closed list proportional representation system in the Senate, but then have a zipper system that is oriented around regions. So you need to go Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, and you'd want to put a gender component into that presumably as well. So there, with that system, you would be building stronger parties, because closed list proportional representation is the gold standard for promoting party discipline and stronger parties, and have clearer regional representation, and keep it as a national body that has that sort of representation of national interest. So just an idea. I think that both of you have highlighted that this is something to be studied, but there are some creative solutions, and let's just be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because if there's, again, one thing positive you can say about Philippine political parties is they tend to be national. And if they were to move to a regional basis, it would be a very dangerous thing in terms, if you want to have national level public goods come out of the legislature. Thank you.
Dr. Tigno and then Commissioner Guia after.
Yeah. Well, my personal take on the question about the Senate isn't about its geographical coverage, whether it's national or, I mean, I'm fine with the national composition of its members. I'm also fine with the 24. What I'm not fine with is the fact that, as Paul has already mentioned, it's a multi-member plurality body. And being a multi-member plurality body, it simply means that it's every man, every person for himself who's running for position. That even if you're placed on the same slate, you see the other person, your co-slate candidate, as a competitor also. And so you fight over each other in the run for position on who will be in the magic 12 spot. What I would go for is to introduce some kind of electoral mechanism that would somehow incentivize cooperation among the candidates, among the members of the Senate. The idea of block voting we've had some experience of it in the past, and I think it's about time that we should also reconsider this kind of option to encourage multi-member bodies to be more cooperative and not to be fragmented. Thank you.
Commissioner Guia.
Just quickly, actually, I was about to ask Professor Hutchcroft about making the Senate PR and the lower house as single member district. So I think he answered it already. Thank you.
Yep, okay, basically the idea is you already have a multi-member district in place. And PR works very well with multi-member districts, and you'd want to make sure that it's closed list if your goal is to strengthen political parties. And there could be mechanisms to try to encourage both gender balance as well as regional balance within that. Worth considering having one of these electoral system experts come in and give some advice and look at some other examples around the world. And I don't put myself in that category, but there are people around that could come in to give their thoughts on that.
Okay, I'm going to ask the last question, which was posted earlier, and for Dr. Arugay. What can the youth do to combat fake news on social media? Very briefly.
I just want to add a last thing about the Senate and the reforms. The reforms sound good, but so long as political dynasties remain the unit of electoral competition, whatever kind of mechanism you put in place, political dynasties tend to find a way. There are instances wherein husband and wife would locate themselves in different districts and then win seats. That somehow will take off the geographic aspect of what Paul said, and could also satisfy the gender aspect of the zipper system. So what I'm saying is there needs to be that provision in our Constitution that remains to be untouched, but it should be self-executing, but it's not. And that is the anti-dynasty constitutional provision. So long as we don't break that down, they are savvy enough to go around all these types of mechanisms. I answered that in the chat, but let me repeat what I said about fake news. First and foremost, we know the expression charity begins at home. Fact-checking disinformation begins at home as well. I think there will have to be very difficult, but I think it's worthwhile conversations that starts at home about fake news, because polarization has penetrated even the households. We know that certain families would not even talk to one another on the basis of political opinions. That's how you know that polarization is pernicious. I do think for the youth, they're more savvy. I do think that the victims of disinformation are more the older generation, where I would even locate myself. We're the ones, and those who are older than us, we're the ones that tend to believe. My dad would even say that, oh, it's in Facebook, it must be true. Oh, they're covering it in the news. Because if you look at the news today, it's what is happening on social media. Social media is the news. So the thing that must happen is that it must begin at home. For the youth, they're more savvy, I think, in the use of this technology. They were born with this technology, unlike us. So they know where to look. They have more access to sources, therefore they have more ability. But I think what is really needed is the critical thinking aspect. And that, I think, should be forged at basic education as well as tertiary education. And finally, it's always good to conduct oneself online in terms of one's behavior, to report fake news and trolls quite diligently, to have due diligence. Don't feed the trolls. If a troll made a comment on your post, delete it. Because if you don't, the troll will get the monetary compensation for doing the work, right? So anytime a suspected troll, how do you know it's a troll? 3 names that are not related with one another, that's a troll. Someone who has less than maybe 100 friends on Facebook, that will likely be a troll. I'm not saying automatic. If the Facebook account has been recently been created, there are more chances that that person is a troll as well. So one must have to figure out these kinds of things. And I think the youth is more than empowered to do this.
Okay, so there's never enough time when we're talking about elections, especially the 2022 elections, which is existential for some people. We heard about the trappings of democracy, the need for an overhaul of the political system, amending the constitution, repealing the 40-year-old election law, massive public education, media and social media literacy, which are imperative for to have reform in the political system. So I'd like to call now on Dr. Tonet Roquisa to give her closing remarks.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Luz. Actually, thank you again. So this is going to be a very short closing remark. I just like to, again, on behalf of the UP Diliman Task Force Nation Building, I'd like to thank the Program of Social and Political Change of UPCIDS, and in particular, Dr. Jorge Tigno, for convening this webinar. And I'm sure, and I've seen the chat, that this has been a very informative and discussion and conversation. I'd also like to thank Dr. Jean and Encinas-Franco and Dr. Aries Arugay for their research, and that we actually added on to our knowledge of what are the issues that we need to be looking into as far as elections are concerned. Dr. Hutchcroft, who I think has already said his goodbye, na suki talaga ng UP, and then of course our Comelec officials, si Director James Jimenez, and also Attorney Luie Guia. And lastly, but of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank Professor Luz Rimban for agreeing to moderate. It's not an easy job, given that you have to be on your toes, given that we are, there has been a real conversation from different perspective. Maraming salamat, Luz, for your providing helping lead the discussion on today's webinar. I'd also like to just plug that on November 26th, we are going to be having the next webinar promotion entitled Promoting Further Devolution After 3 Decades of the 1991 Local Government Code. And in particular, one of the issues will be the Mandanas ruling. Maraming salamat sa lahat, for our panelists, for Luz, for our crew, and to the participants. We hope you had this. We hope you had a good call and mobilization. Sabi nga ni Dr. Tigno and everybody else that we do need a empowered and an educated citizenship to actually push for the electoral and political reforms that we want. Kailangan manggaling sa atin. And we hope that this conversation has helped in terms of guiding us kung ano yung mga kailangan natin gawin para the 2022 election will make a difference in people's lives. Thank you.
Maraming salamat, Dr. Rakisa. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. See you at the next forum. Have a good Friday. Happy weekend.